not 100% perfect, but I'll show you how to touch up these minor mistakes later on. Now, here comes the super satisfying part of removing the tape, revealing a nice contrast between the stained wood and the bright white plaster. This worked out much better than I thought it would. To be honest, I thought I'd screw it up and have to redo at least a couple of the walls, but luckily everything turned out great on the first try. As I mentioned earlier, the tape worked out pretty well for the most part, but there's still some minor imperfections where the plaster got underneath the tape and on top of the wood. An easy way to fix this is to use the same acrylic wash that we use for the wood and apply it over the unwanted plaster bits on the wood. Next, it's time to glue the walls together using foam safe super glue. You probably noticed that I didn't fill some of the edges with plaster. I wanted to wait until those walls were assembled at the corners before pouring the plaster to make sure everything fit properly with no gaps. for the roof cap, so I opted to cut these strips of balsa wood, the same thickness of the shingles, and run them on top of each side of the piece. They held nicely in place with super glue, and any excess overhanging wood was cut away with an X-Acto blade. Next, I gave the whole roof a coat of diluted Mod Podge like I did with the wood on the walls. Again, this will help seal the wood surface so that your washes flow across the wood, rather than soaking directly in. With the shingles on the cabin, I used shellac instead. I'd say that the shellac worked okay in comparison, but the Mod Podge really seems to soak into the wood better and leave a more durable shell over top of the wood. So, I prefer it over the shellac. Once dry, I start applying my dark brown wash to the shingles. This wash is darker than the one that I used for the walls, and I use Van Dyke brown and black to make this wash. Van Dyke brown kind of has a nice, earthy green undertone to it, and I think it's a nice base coat for the moss effects that I'm going to add later on. Again, I want this roof to look like it's in a damp environment, not necessarily like it's currently being rained on, but maybe it rained a few days before, and the moisture gave the shingles a darker appearance. Even after sealing the shingles, the wash can be a bit difficult to apply due to the irregularity of the surface, so be sure to take your time and do your best to cover all of the cracks and crevices between the shingles. Now I'm covering the underside of the chipboard that hangs over the wall with some 3/16" basswood strips. Each strip is simply cut to size and then glued into place with super glue. Then, additional support pieces were glued on top. While this isn't a prominent feature of the building, I think finishing off the little details like this really help add to the realism of the piece. Next, I coat the newly applied wood using the same brown wash I used on the walls. Because this wood is sheltered from the elements, it should be a lighter color than the damp wood on the roof. Lastly, I glue on some 3/8" trim pieces along the edges of the roof to finish off the look. A light sanding helps bring out the pronounced wood grain texture on these pieces. With these pieces installed, here's how the building looks so far, and I'm happy with the way it's looking, but I want to add some more interest to the roof since it's a large area that's more or less the same all the way throughout. I start by brushing a highly diluted coat of matte Mod Podge onto the shingles, and then I randomly sprinkle some ground-up leaves on top. The Mod Podge will dry completely clear, and I continue to sprinkle these blended leaves across the entire roof. Once dry, I add some Mod Podge along the bottom edges of the shingles. Then, I sprinkle some Woodland Scenics Fine Earth and the color burnt grass over top. I applied it heaviest where I thought reference images to kind of get an idea for the shapes of the stones that you're going to be carving. But once you've been carving for a while, you kind of just get the hang of what you're doing. This initial scribing step is super important for defining the outer shapes of the stones, but as you can see, it only gives a faint outline of the stonework. That's okay though, the next few steps will help make these shapes look like actual rock. After the shapes are scribed with a knife, I widen the gaps using the mechanical pencil. Doing this also helps slightly round off the edges of the stones and gives them a more natural, realistic look. It also helps deepen the gaps and helps each stone appear more defined. The actual rocky texture is added by stamping a ball of aluminum foil onto the surface. It leaves an impression which I think nicely resembles a realistic stone texture. Now, it's just a matter of doing these steps over the rest of the stone walls. You may be wondering why I didn't start my project making the first floor first and inscribing all of the stones. To be honest, when I first started this project, I wasn't really in the mood to carve thousands of tiny stones right off the bat. I figured it would be better for me to just do this later on in the process. For me, carving these stones is very enjoyable, but I have to be in the mood to do it. Anyways, here are all of the textured walls, and it was cool to see the texture over the entire surface. The next step is to give all of the walls a base coat of black paint. I'm just using cheap acrylic craft paint for this step, and I'm doing my best to get full coverage. It can be a bit difficult to get between all of the cracks of the stone texture, so just cover it up as best as you can. Most of the deep cracks will be filled with spackle later on anyways. Once dry, I coat the walls with a gray dry brush layer. This helps bring out some of that texture we created with the aluminum flow. Dry brushing stones is a great and easy technique since it allows all of the deeper cracks and shadows to remain darker while highlighting the raised outermost edges with the brighter color. I know the gray looks pretty bright going on, but it dries much darker. Now, I use my hand stove by a spackle. This step is pretty messy but straightforward. I press and smear the spackle into all of the cracks between the stones. This can take a while, but it's a lot of fun. Any excess spackle on the surface can be wiped away with a paper towel. I just continue forward with spackling all of the stone surfaces. With the spackle and all of the cracks, I take the border joints using a wash of Lego buck. I know it looks a bit yellowish going on, but once we're done, the border will have a nice off-whitish tan color. I also apply a heavy coat of beige over the entire surface, which will add some more color and variety. Then, I blot off any excess using a paper towel. In case anyone is wondering, my references for the stonework came from pictures that I found of medieval structures in France. All of the buildings had really tan border lines, and the stones were a very pronounced dark brown color. I'll be adding some brown tones to the individual stones, but I wanted to keep the overall wall looking like a more blackish gray color. As I just mentioned, I vary the color of some of the stones by painting a few individually using burnt umber. I just randomly select them as I go. Then, I cover the entire surface again with a beige wash to kind of tone down some of the brown stones. I dilute some of the burnt umber with water and start to smudge it all over the surface using my brush and fingers. Then, I go back and vary some more stones with the darker paint background. As you can see, we're using colors that we've used on previous parts of the build. Even though they represent different materials, using the same or similar colors across the whole piece will add a sense of color unity to the project, making it look much more cohesive overall. Before it dries completely, I blot some of the paint off using a paper towel to make the effect more subtle. As you can see, my workflow isn't really linear. I honestly just keep doing stuff until I'm happy with the way it looks. I often find that if I try to structure the process too simply, it limits my ability to achieve realistic results. That's why you might see me apply a wash, paint some stones, apply another wash, paint more stones, apply another wash, etc. For me, it's the culmination of all of the layers that adds to the depth of the surface textures, even if it may seem counterintuitive or redundant at the moment. Lastly, I spackle some diluted white paint over the entire wall. I honestly really like this effect. If you go too heavy-handed, you can easily blot off any unwanted specks. Also, while it looks like a lot right now, the paint is highly diluted, so it'll fade a lot by the time it dries, and it'll look less pronounced. If you go around looking at natural stonework, rocks, sidewalks, etc., oftentimes you'll see lots of white dots and stains, and this replicates exactly that. For the large stone pieces around each window and door, I decided to paint them a lighter grayish tan color. This helps to add some nice variety and contrast to the wall, making it look more interesting than an overall one-note texture and color. To Make sure you use a low temp hot glue gun, otherwise you run the risk of melting the XPS foam if your glue gun is too hot. Try to get the corners lined up as best as you can, but again, any small gaps will be filled later on. I joined the top of the building with the bottom right side using some foam safe super glue. The remaining bottom pieces were assembled in the same way with hot glue and then fixed into position. The chimney was added on top using foam safe super glue, and here's how the building looks more or less fully assembled. Again, there are some small gaps to fill and other small details to add, but it's nice to see the project finally taking shape. Small gaps along the seams are filled with spackle using a brush. This doesn't have to be perfect, as we'll be painting over the spackle to blend everything in anyways. Once the spackle dries, I apply a dark wash to the stones on each corner to color the spackle to the right tone. Then, I blend any irregularities by applying another heavy coat of beige, and that seems to do the trick. Now it's time to start the groundwork of the diorama. For the base, I'm using a 2-foot by 3-foot sheet of plywood and adding a small stone road outside of the tavern using thin sheets of XPS foam. I glue these foam pieces in place using a tacky glue. I'm going to kind of skim over the stone process, since you've seen me carve thousands of stones already, but this is nothing more than an old simple cobblestone road. I spread the lines across the road roughly 3/16 of an inch apart from one another, and then I scribe squarish-shaped stones along those lines. Again, the gaps are widened, this time using a ballpoint pen which creates wider gaps than the mechanical pencil. I wanted the road to be really rough and rustic looking, so irregularities are welcomed at this stage. Then, the ball of aluminum foil is pressed across the surface to add more texture. I glue in a short stone wall along the left side of the road using hot glue. I made this wall the same way I made the walls for the tavern, however, I don't plan on filling the gaps with spackle, and I'm going to paint it with different gray tones to give it a different look. This is how the base looks so far, and the next step is to base coat all of the foam using the black sheet of graphite. The road gets dry brushed in a dark gray pass, along with another slightly lighter dry brush pass to bring out the surface texture. The stone wall is painted in a similar manner, but in the end I wanted the wall to be slightly brighter than the road. So after applying the gray tones, I randomly applied a heavy stipple coat of white acrylic paint, which made these very pronounced patchy spots along the wall, which I really like the effect of. Instead of spackle, I filled the gaps of the road by using some dry dirt that I got outside the house. I sprinkled it across and brushed it into the cracks with a chip brush. I darkened the color of the dirt by applying the Van Dyke brown wash all over the surface, which soaked into the dirt and locked it in place. When the surface is still wet, I sprinkled some more dirt on top and I brushed it into the cracks for an even more convincing appearance. After this, individual stones were painted an off-white color and wiped away with a paper towel bag so the variety of the stonework. I quickly made a balsa wood door and stained it with the lighter wood shade that I used on the walls of the building. I glued it in place using super glue and then added a handle that I made from wire and 2 long hinges that I made from Chinese strips. I applied hot glue to the base where I wanted the building to sit, and then I gently set the building in place. To fill the gap between the door and the road, I quickly made some stone steps out of XPS foam and I glued them in place using hot glue. I wanted to add a little storage shack on the right side of the building, so I glued some balsa wood strips together until I was happy with the overall shape. This reminded me a lot of the process of building the porch roof for the cabin diorama. The rafter pieces were notched to fit around the front beam, and the other side was glued directly onto the stone wall. To add some interest to the terrain, I glued some pink foam to the base to act as landforms and to provide some nice variation in height to the ground of the diorama. Any gaps between the pink foam and the walls were filled with Sculptamold, and I just continued to fill the gaps all the way around the building. Any slopes that I carved from pink foam were also completely covered in Sculptamold in order to give the slopes a more natural progression and texture than the carved pink foam. I like working with Sculptamold for these applications Essentially all it is dirt from my front yard, water, Mod Podge, and plaster. When it's still wet, I sprinkle some fine sand over top of the surface, which soaks into the dirt and helps it dry faster while adding additional texture. I repeat this process across the brown painted areas on the entire model base. I wanted the edges of the cobblestone road to be more irregular and less defined, so I sprinkled some loose dirt around the perimeter of the road. Then, I soaked the loose dirt with isopropyl alcohol and applied diluted Mod Podge over top to lock everything in place. I really liked the dirt texture as it was drying. However, I thought that the color of the dirt was too bright for a damp environment. So, I made a diluted Van Dyke brown wash and I applied it all over the dirt using a brush once the dirt was completely dry. I know the color change looks much darker, but it will be slightly lighter when it dries. One thing I hope this encourages you to do is to not be afraid of painting your scenery. Over the years, I was accustomed to just working with the natural color of materials and products that I was using, and I was making my scenery that way. But painting my scenery has allowed me to make much better and cohesive scenery for my specific dioramas, and I can have endless color variety without having to buy dozens of the same product in different colors. As I mentioned earlier, the dirt lightens a bit once it dries, but it looks much darker than before and it nicely resembles a damp ground. The ground cover, I sprinkled dry moss that I shredded in a blender, as well as these squishy pine cone looking things that I found on the ground that I also ran through the blender. These give a nice orangey tone to the ground, which helps it look like a woodland autumn ground cover. I simply sprinkle both of these blended materials over the dirt to add texture and color to the groundwork. Last year, I made some of these leaves using big bunches of green stuff wool, and I decided to apply them all over the cobblestone road. Once all the scatter was in place, I soaked everything with isopropyl alcohol and diluted that Mod Podge like before to lock down all of the loose ground texture. It always looks super bad and messy at this stage, but after leaving it overnight, all of the white glue mess is gone, and the loose ground cover is firmly locked in place with the base. I could have done this earlier, but I decided to add a bunch of random twigs and branches that I gathered from outside, as well as a few pieces of gravel that act as boulders and large rocks. They were both glued in place using tacky glue. I wanted to add some more green tones to the groundwork, so I applied a ton of mossy patches the same way I did to the roof. Again, I had to work in small sections to prevent the glue from drying too quickly before sprinkling on some more fine turf. Since I was working on much larger areas on a huge model base, I used a little handheld hoover to vacuum up any fine turf powder. This worked super well, and again, I just continued around the entire model base doing this. Like before, I loosely applied moss more or less on the left sides of things to indicate that the light source needed to came from the right side. But again, this didn't prevent me from adding a little bit of moss on all sides of the diorama. With all of the moss glued down, I again painted the moss using the same method and colors that I used on the roof. This was probably one of my favorite parts of the entire build. For whatever reason, it's just lots of fun to paint moss. You also don't have to be very precise, as any paint that gets on rocks or the ground and the surrounding areas will help blend the moss into the environment. At first, I was contemplating whether I should add lots of vegetation and bushes to the diorama. However, after marking up some ideas, the only thing that I liked were these twin bushes from diorama present day out front of the tavern, so I just glued them in place with tacky glue. Next, I stained the side shed with acrylic washes and added some horizontal wood strips on top. From there, I added some more shingles and painted them in the same way as before. I also forgot to add these wooden supports under the overhangs, so I quickly glued them in place using super glue. Lastly, I glued some barrels that I